Prain.
Thank you. Wow, good morning. Okay, now I'm reassured that's going to work. So, as Mark said, if we've met before, I'm Leanne, and standing here truly is a full circle moment for me. I worked for SFU Woodward's cultural programs for 5.5 years, between 2011 and 2016. So I really was here when the cultural program was being built. Just shortly before the pandemic, I stepped down as the chapter president of GDCBC, which is now known as DESCAN. We literally had our AGM 3 days before lockdown, and we were not quite sure if we should have an event, so I was like cleaning tables with Lysol wipes, which are really hard to get, and we told people to give each other elbow bumps because that was going to be a thing. And I had this idea I was going to sit down and write a book, and of course the whole world went a little bit crazy 3 days later. And I think actually the last public event I was at before the pandemic, aside from the AGM, was CreativeMornings with Stanley Hainsworth. So it's really fascinating to be here to stand on stage, because I'm so used to being at the back of the room where I know all the cultural workers and Creative Morning people are. So thank you for having me. I see a wave or two. Yeah. So the truth is, I'm really not a morning person. My brain wakes up at about 9:30, so you'll probably hear me stumble over my words. And in preparing for this talk, of course, I did the thing people normally do. I went and looked up a bunch of quotes on the internet about truth. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is, I guess Elvis once sang about truth and said, "Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it ain't going away." So a lot of what I did for this talk was to think about what are some of my long-standing truths. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So this is me, age 4. And this is my favorite photo of me that's ever been taken. I don't think any photo will ever top this. I was at a birthday party. I'm obviously a child of the 70s and 80s. So the things I love about this photo, it proves I actually had blonde hair. For a very short period of my life, this was my hair color. You'll notice there'll be some very embarrassing photos of me in this talk. Notice what we used to call bangs. They're now called fringes, apparently. That's been pretty consistent. Also consistent is my love of flamboyant clothing. If you know me, you know I love a good pattern. I've always wearing something a little bit wacky. But the thing I love most about this photo is you can see that I have opinions. Right? Look at that stuff. And that's something that has absolutely not changed. And in preparation for this talk, I also decided to do a really informal survey of family and friends. And I used the one form I could think of. I put up a poll and I put it out on Facebook. And I said, tell me what you think of me. And it kind of backfired a bit. Everybody said you're quiet. I'm like, have you met me recently? Everybody said you're a cat lady. And I'd like to say, I have one cat, She's 18, but I have one cat. So I do not wear cat clothing. Where's this coming from? But anyways, as we know, we all have opinions of ourselves and people have opinions of us. And that's a little bit of what I want to talk about today. And, as part of life is also growth and change. And so in order to really talk about what I want to talk about, I want to ask you some questions. So maybe we'll start with the first one. Is everybody comfortable right now? Physically comfortable? Yeah. So I did bring Creative Mornings here. And part of bringing Creative Mornings here was making sure we could get enough of you in the room. So I'm sorry that your chairs are uncomfortable and your jacket is wet and it's on your lap and you're probably holding too many pieces of paper. Appreciate you being here. So now we're really going to tell the truth. So I'm just curious who's in the room today for the folks I don't know. Who would identify as a performing artist? Great. Designers? A few more designers. Artisans? Visual artists? Photographer, videographers? Filmmakers? Interdisciplinary artists? A few. I saw a few like this, right? And think about this room. We're actually in an interdisciplinary art space. And that was one of the really interesting things about working here is watching people who were very fluid, who could move through different disciplines every day. So I'm going to ask you a few more questions. Who does more than one creative thing? Yeah, okay. Who works in a creative field professionally and wishes they could work in more than one discipline? Oh, two hands. Who wants to work in more than one discipline but feels like they might be judged for not being quite as serious at what they do? Even Mark, interesting. And who feels like if they were going to work in more than one creative field, people would assume that they're not really good at anything? So I felt that pain. And so today I wanted to share something that it took me a really long time to learn and get comfortable with. You get to be more than one thing, right? Oh. So intellectually, we know we get to be more than one thing. Like I saw all the hands go up. But the hard part is I think the majority of creative people introduce themselves through one label, right? I'm a writer, I'm a dancer, I'm a filmmaker, I'm a designer. And occasionally, there's 3 or 4 of you who would say I'm an interdisciplinary artist. But most of the time we pick a shorthand. And it usually depends who we're talking to, right? And so last year I had this young woman reach out to me on LinkedIn, and we had this Zoom call during, the height of lockdown. And she said, how could one person do all these things? And she was really interesting. My LinkedIn bio, if you were to look at it, like I've done a lot of different jobs and maybe not in the order you would expect me to. And this isn't in any particular order, but I think it sums up my career path. And my answer to her was sort of that pat answer, like, well, I've been around a while. This is work, over 25 years. But really what I've discovered over time is most of my artistic or professional life has just been following what I really love to do in a given moment, and I always sort of know the next thing I want to do. It's usually chasing experiences that I want to have and seeing places I can be of service. It hasn't always been logical or straightforward, but I've tried to get really comfortable over time, knowing that my path won't be very straightforward. I've worked as a designer, I've worked as a design manager, I've worked in branding, cultural promotion, strategic communication, and back again. And I didn't sort of bounce back and forth because I didn't enjoy my work. In fact, I think I love my work a little bit too much. I've had fantastic employers, and the best of them have recognized that I'm someone who doesn't follow job titles. Mostly I follow the work that I want to do, even when it doesn't seem like that's what I should do, logically. And, the more I try new things, the more I feel like it builds my confidence to start again and to try new things and to be a little bit less afraid. But most people usually know me for this. So you'll hear this referenced a few times. And before I get into it, if you haven't seen this stuff before, it's often referred to as yarn bombing or knit graffiti or yarn storming. And so this is a piece I made about 14 years ago in Victoria. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So to be frank, all these roles that I play in the world often make people not know what to think of me. And the truth is, I thought, everybody's gonna think I'm the crazy yarn lady today. And I often think about that when I go for job interviews, like, have they Googled me? Okay, if they have, they Googled me, and usually I'm very honest about what I do because I don't want it to be a surprise. So I'm a walking contradiction a lot of the time. I'm a global known authority on yarn bombing, which is what you just saw. But I've also worked as a corporate creative in the public sector most of my career. I've spent a lot of time as a graphic designer and in the design community, but most of my spare time is in thinking about publishing. I have a little letterpress I bought myself during the pandemic. I host writers groups in my living room. I even have a Zoom writers group I've been hosting for the last couple of years. I'm also a complete introvert. I'm very reserved, but I love programming community events and coming up with weird and spontaneous projects, which means sometimes I need to take a podium. I'm known as a craftivist, but I can also be a president of a design society. So I've written 4 traditionally published books on the topics of subversive embroidery, storytelling through textiles, knit graffiti, community activism projects. And if I was to choose one label to introduce myself at a party, I would probably say that I'm a writer. But despite 4 books, there are still days where I doubt myself, and I wonder if I can write anything at all. And when that happens, I have to harness what I like to call my Danielle Steele energy. Has anyone ever read a Danielle Steele novel? Oh, good. I actually haven't, but I love her. I am a fan. I'm a fan because of this. So what I learned about Danielle Steele, she's written 190 books. It's one person, no ghostwriters, 190 books on a typewriter. She doesn't use a computer. Apparently, according to her bio, and I don't even know how this is humanly possible, she writes for 20 to 22 hours a day. She has 7 children, and she's 75 years old. And this is her desk, made of her books. Like, she's earned this, right? Like, and, you know, I think oftentimes when we think of somebody, like, really into their career, it's this. Like, you couldn't be anything but what you are. And, you know, all props to Danielle Steele. That's who she is. But, you know, I think for me, even though I'm going to talk a little bit about my childhood, I've always been into writing. I've also always been into visual art. And in truth, I spent a lot of years really frustrated that I couldn't just pick one path. And why couldn't it just be one thing? I could be more credible. I could be more successful. I could be more confident if I could just pick one thing. In fact, I spent a lot of time beating myself up about it. So a little bit of my origin story. This is Comox, where I grew up, very close to Comox Nation. This is a beach called Goose Spit. This is around the corner from my parents' house. So my family is 5 generations of settlers, 2 Comox. I literally had family get off a boat from Scotland in the 1800s to join Comox logging. My father, my grandfather, and I were actually all born at St. Joe's, the local hospital. And this is my family in the 70s. I'm the bald one. So I had the incredible privilege to be born into a family who supported creativity in whatever form it took. And everyone in my family is creative, but they're all creative in very different ways. And as I've moved through my life, I've realized what an incredible privilege that is. Not all creative people have that. And most people spend their whole lives trying to find that encouragement. So my older sister that Mark mentioned was trained to become a classical ballet dancer. My mother is this insane kind of gardener that gardens like 8 hours a day, and she grows lemons and quinces and things outside that shouldn't grow outside, does seed saving. And my dad is a boat builder. So he was a carpenter that built the house I grew up in, and when I was in high school, he would build things like this. It's a junk rig. So a lot of my growing up was around boats and ballet studios. And one of the things I would say about my family's creativity is it has a certain flavor. That's sort of where we're unified. We do impossible things. And as a way to describe that is, there was once this Father's Day kite fly, and all the kids were supposed to make kites and bring them. And my dad made literally this wooden framed 7-foot kite that I covered in like paper, newsprint, and everybody looked at it and thought, well, that's not gonna fly. And sure enough, my dad being my dad, we went out to this kite fly, and we had the highest flying kite. I got a ribbon for it. I was at my parents' house a few years ago, and the land next to them was undeveloped. And I looked at my neighbor's driveway, and I said, it's red sand. And my mother's like, oh, well, of course it was. This is all my years of gardening. I've made earth. My sister, as Mark mentioned, is deaf, and she was told in the 1980s she shouldn't be a dancer because of it. She started, starring in every local ballet. She performed at Expo 86, and eventually she went on to teach at the National Ballet School of Canada. So for me, it's always been that healthy spirit of wanting to try things I'm often told are not possible, because when I was a child, frankly, everything was possible if you tried. So as a kid, I spent a lot of time at the public library. My dad's mother and my mother both worked there for over 35 years. You'll still find my mother there if you're in Courtney Public Library. And I had this weird experience where everybody knew me from birth at the library. And rather than pay for a babysitter, frankly, I would just get dropped off at the library after school. And so I was the kid that read. I can walk and read, I can read backwards. I got in trouble for reading a math class once. That's where I spent all my time. So you can see how I am. I never had a choice. And so I was a super advanced reader as a kid, and for some reason, I think my grade 2 teacher didn't want to deal with me. So they sent me down the hall, and I sat in a room with an Apple II computer, and they told me to make a school newspaper. And I don't think I ever did, but that was really my entry into layout and design. So when I was in grade 11, it was 1993. This is my most embarrassing photo. I still have the bangs. And if you weren't alive in 1993, let me remind you of that era. It was 90210 was a shocking show on TV for teenagers. It was the year before Kurt Cobain died. I think Aerosmith's Amazing had come out. It was really the pre-internet era. And nobody ever talked to me about my career in high school at all. I think my family assumed I would do something creative. And so what they did is they sent us down to the school library that I think ran WordPerfect, something that involved a little bit of coding. And they spit out this test. And for some reason, I've held on to it because every year I look at it to say, have I done these things yet? And there were two things on that test that I think still read true. My strengths were I like organizing and directing work. And the second one was abstract or creative work. And then these were the jobs, which is like the whack-a-mole of jobless. Like, I'm never gonna be an actress. I love music, I'm not musical. I still don't know what a foreign service officer is. I have taught art, but I think I held on to this. I was really curious about what an art director did. But again, this is the pre-internet era, so I really had no idea. I thought they worked maybe with film or something like that. So the only thing I really remember from high school is having a conversation with one of my teachers who said, don't go into professional art because you can never make a deadline. And even in high school, I always made deadlines, so I remember thinking, really? But then I was an over-involved kid who did too many things, and I think he thought, well, you're not focused. And shortly after high school, I ended up getting a job at a community arts council, and I worked in Courtenay doing that for 5 summers, and then I did that in North Vancouver for 2 years, and it was one of the best things I ever did. And so I did that job while going to UBC, and what I did there was a double major in creative writing and art history, and I did a ton of fine arts courses. This is me in a Roy Arden class trying to be Cindy Sherman, so I'm about 20-ish around there. But I absolutely loved my time there. But I had this really interesting world where I was working at the Belkin Art Gallery as an assistant and, supporting shows like Rodney Graham exhibition. Then I was going to my art history classes and reading what was like radical essays about Indigenous art, which is very bizarre for me, being from Comox. And then I was working in the summers in like Kate's Park doing lantern festivals with New Canadians. And I couldn't figure out how these 3 worlds fit together. Meanwhile, in creative writing, I was really enjoying working around other writers and writing stories, but I was far more interested in like ordering zines and finding like magazines and experimenting than, frankly, producing the great Canadian novel. And I remember getting into a conversation with one of my profs about high art versus low art. And for me, that's always been a really strange thing to divide those things. And it's often an undercurrent theme in my books that I write. Like, how do we break those things down? So by the time I finished my undergrad, I had this impression that in order to be a professional creative, there were certain things you had to do. So if you were a writer, you needed an agent and 3 book deals, and you needed to write all the time and sell your work to CBC. If you're a visual artist, you needed to get an MFA and be, showing in New York galleries. And when I graduated UBC, some of my classmates were actually doing that. And for a long time, I beat myself up because I wasn't on that path, but I didn't see the path I actually was on. And so I spent a year after my undergrad going to Langara College and taking a publishing diploma at that time and learning all the aspects of publishing as, the technology of publishing and how to publish a magazine. And it was my intention actually to become an editor, but I ended up getting a job at UBC and going back there. And over time, what was supposed to be an editorial assistant job morphed into a designer job, and eventually I was given the title of senior communications designer. There's one cat, right? This is my favorite GIF of all time, so there's no better GIF than this, or GIF. So when I was at that job, because I'm primarily a self-taught designer, aside from my 1-year diploma, we had 1 design class, and again, I'm a nerd, I love to read, so for the first 7 years of my job, all I did was read everything and anything to do with design I could get my hands on. I had this amazing coworker who helped mentor me, taught me a lot about type. Don't judge my PowerPoint slides. But there was this really highly experienced designer that had been hired sort of to look at design across campus. And I really wanted his approval. So every time we had a meeting, I would bring mock-ups and hope for feedback. And from day 1, he decided he didn't want anything to do with me. And my insecurity showed. And I got to a point where I figured, well, I'll find other community, which is around the time I met Mark, who still had hair. And he wrote me into volunteering. It was great. Yeah. But I had run into this person in a coffee shop, and I was about to take a week's vacation because I was really missing writing, and I'd saved up to go to this writing workshop in Victoria. And as I was sharing with him what I was doing the next week, he kind of turned around and said to me, "Oh, so you're a writer now too?" The cat. Right? I don't give up easily. So my number one learning from this is pick your mentors wisely. So it was a small exchange, but it struck me that people really do expect us to be one thing. So going back to job titles, what I would call, your creative persona, I often find that choosing these words can be a guidepost when you're young and you're first starting out, and they give us something to aspire to, something we can work towards. They can put us on our career path, but sometimes they also give other people too much leeway to box us in. There's often this undercurrent, right? You can't be a professional if you also talk about street art. You can't be a writer and a designer. You can be good at this, but you can't be competent at that then. So the thing I'm probably most well known for is a book I co-authored called Yarn Bombing, The Art of Crochet and Knit Graffiti. In many circles, I'm a craftivist or a yarn bomber, which is someone who uses textiles to create public works of anarchy. And after 10 years of working as a designer, how I got into this, I was trying to write on the side while working more than a full-time job, and I decided if I couldn't be a published writer, I did want to go back and work in the book industry. So I came to SFU. I went to the publishing program that's based at Harbor Center, and I did their MPub program, and I fully intended to end up back in the industry working as a book designer. And the program teaches you how to become a publisher, and one of the major projects we had was to pitch an art book. And I was paired in a group that encouraged me to pursue this. So I had just learned how to knit. Blogs were fairly new. I'm a terrible knitter still to this day. I like color and putting things together. I'm not, a fine crafts person. And my friend had taught me one stitch, and I had taught her another stitch. And then we thought, oh God, we need help. So we started a blogspot blog called Knitting and Beer. And we only knew 7 other knitters from all over the Lower Mainland. So we met at Metrotown at a mall and knit in a pub there. And at one point in time, this woman named Mandy had shown up, who worked for an online magazine called Knitty. She taught me a few things. I thought she was super cool. And, I'd kind of forgotten. So in the process of making this art book, my instructor had said to me, oh, if you're going to do a book on yarn bombing, don't use a fake American author. I'd put Debbie Stoller, who had some famous knitting books out at the time. Choose a real Canadian person, this Canadian press. So I cyberstalked Mandy, I grabbed her bio off the internet, stuck it on the proposal, and really didn't think anything about it. And so weeks later, we had the opportunity to pitch this book to real publishers who came to give us feedback. And the cover of the book had this image, which is a knitted tank by Marian Jorgensen that was created with the combined efforts of a whole bunch of knitters to protest the US-Iraq war. And I remember a retired literary agent telling me at the time that my idea was ridiculous and nobody cared about knitting. And I kind of knew better than that, so I defended myself. And, hadn't really thought a lot about that day until the project came to a close. And I received an email from one of my instructors saying that my publisher now, Arsenal Pulp Press, had requested a meeting, and could I bring Mandy in with me? And then my heart dropped, because I didn't know Mandy at all. And if you've learned anything from this talk, I don't give up very easily. So I sent her an email and said, hi, we met once. You taught me how to do short rows. Would you like to write a book on knit graffiti with me? And of course, luckily she said yes. And with the help of so many friends and family, it was truly a group effort. We wrote and published this book in 10 months, everything from photography to knitting editing patterns, to getting friends and family to actually pose because we had no budget to travel around the world to meet the yarn bombers we were interviewing. And I was keeping this blog that went viral, had more than my 15 minutes of fame. I was in the New York Times, The Guardian. We had documentary crews showing up at my house. It really was a frenzy is the best way I can describe it. So the book's in its 4th printing now. It was in its 3rd printing even before the publish date happened. We got mentioned in Maclean's as Lingo Makers of the Year for the term yarn bombing. And somebody created a National Yarn Bombing Day. It was a bit mad. And it's been in print since 2009. And in 2019, we came back together to do a 10th anniversary edition. So the movement is still growing and growing day by day and being rediscovered. It's even been in German. And we've also gotten to do some really cool projects, like this cherry blossom tree we did with Joy Kagawa House, where the city of Vancouver not only invited us into knit and crochet in council chambers, but we got to use their firefighters who showed up and put cherry blossoms in the tree for us. So what that book really taught me is, I use my writing to answer questions I'm curious about. So if you're not familiar with the contemporary textile community, let me assure you it's endlessly fascinating. Now I've turned my attention to writing more books and stories about people who make things and why they make it. I've written articles on the man embroidery movement, which is a male power embroidery movement, clothing that's designed to help cystic fibrosis patients while they're getting treatment, cradle to grave Canadian shirts and weaving, and most recently an artist who crochets their drag outfits to replicate Nova Scotian mummery costume. And what I've learned about myself as a writer is I get endless joy from writing about other people. And a lot of success for me in writing now is how I can support my readers in figuring out what they want to do or make. And along the way, I've had what you would consider a lot of traditional author success. I've had my 15 minutes of fame. I've done 3 North American-wide book tours. And really, this is for something a lot of people think is ridiculous or without a lot of substance. But I don't think that's the case. So the truth is, I'm growing and changing and trying new things. And so what I'm up to now. So my day job, you probably wouldn't have guessed it unless you know me. I'm the Creative Services Manager at ICBC. And another thread for me is I'm a public service, and I really enjoy working in places that I feel can start to make a change. And this organization's really dedicated to making BC's roads safe and helping its customers more and transforming. So as part of that, I'm working with a team of designers and videographers and storytellers to help the organization succeed. Sometimes I run an art collective. We've been on a little bit of a pause with COVID with my friend Laura. It's called The Imprint. We do really ridiculous things with no goals, such as serving lemonade to strangers in public with poetry on the side of the cups, making strangers write fortunes for other strangers. We've made paper dinner parties, and basically what we're trying to do is get people to engage in acts of creative writing in public. And as I just mentioned, 3 days before the pandemic started, I sat down to write my last book. And that was a really interesting thing as well. I interviewed 23 different artists from around the world, asking why they do public engagement works with their art. And of course, everybody had the world put on hold, particularly people who are used to working with communities. And if you had told me this is what my writer's life would have looked like when I was 17, I don't think I would have believed you. But my current book is a way of working through a lot of those questions I had as a 17-year-old. And what I've learned along the way is, if you need something, somebody else probably needs it too. So here's my truth. You can not only be more than one thing, you can do more than one thing. And it can enrich everything else that you do. So let's be realistic here. There's no perfect. But if you choose to explore the things that interest you, I'm certain you'll find that creative sweet spot between your talents, interests, and ability. And for me, that's often been the cross-section of seemingly unrelated things. And if I've learned anything along the way, having a chosen path doesn't always work out, but instead you might find a better truth. I'm still a work in progress, and I'm so interested in finding out what comes next for me. So in conclusion, I have one thing to ask of you. Listen to yourself, and listen to those people around you when they're telling you that they are more than one thing. I think the best things we can all do is support each other to become our fullest, greatest selves. And that's my truth, and I hope it can be part of your truth too.
So, amazing. We're going to see how that goes. Okay, there's question number 1.
Can I take you out for coffee and be your friend?
Yes.
Question? Can you be friends? Well, that is a prize.
Hi, thank you. Love what you said about you can be good at more than one thing. Just practically, with your job, major role in ICBC, how do you juggle the time management of when that probably takes up so much of your time? How do you juggle being more than one thing and holding down these big roles?
I don't want to say work-life balance, but I do have to say ICBC is very good at encouraging work-life balance. It's the first time I've ever actually had a supervisor who said, make sure you take a lunch and your staff see you take a lunch, because we want everybody to be doing that in a healthy way. But, you know, for me, a lot of the time is you can't be all things all at once, right? So I have years where I'm writing a book, and frankly, my friends don't see me for a really long time. I have years where I'm full out at work, and my writing life suffers a bit. And, you know, it's not easy. I'm not always calm or happy about that, but it's just sort of the way life is. We all have things that take our attention from time to time.
Hi, I know you said that if you need something, then someone else needs it too, but I was wondering, your book ideas are really interesting and abstract. How do you actually come up with the book idea and decide that's what you're going to do?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, sometimes it's a hunch, I have to say, because I'll have had multiple conversations. So of all my books I've written, my third book, Strange Material, is actually my favorite. And part of that is it was really inspired by my creative writing degree and studying all sorts of different kinds of writing, so poetry, screenwriting, and thinking that we all tell stories not just through writing, but through mediums. And I was meeting artists over and over again who'd be like, I'm telling my family story through a quilt. Or I have a running route, and I decided what I'm gonna do is stitch my running route onto plastic bags and staple it up on my running route. There was a woman in Brooklyn who was doing that. And so in meeting people over and over again, I'd start to say like, oh, there's this whole group of people who are kind of telling me the same thing. So I'm gonna chase what that means. Like, how do you use different textile mediums to tell stories in different ways?
Hi, Leanne. Thanks for your talk. I feel much better about my dumpster fire resume now. My one question is, at the beginning of this whole journey in your career, what's the one piece of advice you would give yourself, knowing what you know now?
I mean, I think trust myself more and not feel like I have to justify quite as much. And I think even in writing this talk, you know, I still have days where I'm like, oh, I'm gonna stand up here and people are gonna say, oh, she's just the crazy yarn lady, or, oh, she was my supervisor, but she kind of does this other hobby thing called writing, and I'm actually very serious about my writing career. I write ridiculous books, but you know, reaching my readers and getting books done is like a huge part of my process. I'm very serious about it. So yeah, probably trusting in myself and like not letting that weigh me down too much.
Leanne, do you find spelling and grammar, as also someone who sets type and understands the power of word as set, do you obsess over that, or is that not part of your...
It's not part of, I mean, if you've ever seen a tweet from me, yeah, grammar, not my thing. When I was in publishing school, I had Mary Schillinger, who's one of the founders of Geist magazine, said to me, you have good, what did she say? Good, not good hunches, but like you kind of intuit, and that's often how I write. And you know, writers work with editors. Editors clean us up and challenge us. That's what writers groups do. Like I'll talk about concept, and they'll kind of like ask me challenging questions. Yeah, so for me, it's a lot about pouring out the ideas. And because I read so much as a kid, like I kind of know what forms a book in my head because I've read so many different types of books. So it's just one of those more than 10,000 hours kind of things.
Our creative prompt on our name tags this morning is, who is your creative alter ego? So I thought I'd ask you that.
Oh gosh. So years ago, I was inviting friends to a birthday party, and I made a silly like Facebook graphic. And on that, I had Edna Mole from The Incredibles because of the haircut. I had the little girl from a movie called Adventures in Babysitting who was wearing like the Thor hat. And I think I might have had Margot Tenenbaum, just because. Yeah.
Just because. Mine was Salvador Dali's Ghost.
Mine is Mother Earth. My question is, your father was a boat builder. Did you ever think of becoming a boat builder, because your life journey has been in the boat?
I have built part of one boat. So my father and I built a rowboat together when I was about 10. But no, because I grew up around boats. Like literally most of my childhood was sitting at a wharf reading a book. And my dad's really part of the like West Coast boating scene, which is people who build junk rig boats. There's not too many people around who do that, but it's definitely a movement on the West Coast. And the unique thing about those boats is they're made traditionally of non-materials, so the sails are actually made of tarps, and they have no keel on the bottom of the boat. They're flat, so you can pull them up on a beach. So it's just something that's always been around me. I have not a great sense of the 3D. I'm a 2D kind of person, so I'll leave that to the experts.
One in Zoom, okay. Let's see if we can welcome someone from Zoom.
I can just tell you what it is. It's, what's your next project going to be? And that comes from Leanne.
You know, I don't really know. I'm finishing off an article for someone I just wrote, and I just finished a 5-city book tour 2 weeks ago. So this was my next project. Yeah, I knew I was going to get asked that today, and I'm just not quite sure yet. So.
That's amazing. Well, we're a little long on time, so we're going to wrap it up there. What I encourage you to do, if you have more questions for Leanne, send them to us, either email vancouver@creativemornings.com or any of the social platforms, and we'll make sure that she gets it and we can get you an answer, and we'll publish that for you. Leanne Prain, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Oh,